Welcome back. High-stakes meetings today at the White House. Ukraine's President Zelenskyy and a number of European Union leaders are set to meet with the president this afternoon. It comes after the President Trump and Russian President Putin's summit on Alaska on Friday. Joining us this morning is Michael O'Hanlon, Brookings Institution Foreign Policy Program Director of Research. Michael, welcome back. Good to see you again.
Thank you. Good morning.
The Friday meeting has been pretty well chewed over at this point, but I do wonder what you expect today and whether the notion of land swaps is an area where Zelenskyy can even get close to this afternoon.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are a lot of things to talk about today, and one of them is indeed whether Ukraine would be willing to talk about land swaps. Vladimir Putin wants to talk about land concessions. He hasn't offered any of what he holds back to Ukraine, any of what he's stolen, let's say, in the south. But he wants more in the east without even having to fight for it. And that's his terms of trade, so to speak. For President Zelenskyy, he has ruled out the idea of even doing the swaps, even if they're equitable in some sense, although, of course, none of it's equitable because all of it should be Ukrainian land. So I think one question would be, is the United States able to cajole President Zelenskyy into at least a de facto swap? It may not have to be something that could be legally blessed, and Ukraine could still retain its claims to all the land in some future situation, but acknowledge that for now and forever, it's not going to fight to get that land back. That would be one big topic for conversation.
You think European leaders would go there?
Yeah, I think they're pragmatic enough to know that Ukraine's not going to win back all of its land. And so if the only prescription here is that we, wait until Ukraine has liberated all 19% of its original land that Russia has stolen, that's a recipe for endless war and probably Ukrainian defeat. So I think the Europeans, they may not want to do a swap. They may prefer to just freeze the current front line. But, if you're freezing the front line, you're already acknowledging that Russia's going to hold 18% of pre-war Ukraine. So what difference does it make if you modify that line a little bit? So I would think the Europeans are pragmatic on that point. We'll have to see.
All right. Part of the criticism of Friday's meeting was this notion of leapfrogging a ceasefire, going to a broad peace agreement, people reading into that Putin is obviously hungry for less economic isolation and the prospect of investment and cooperation and world stage and all that. Do you think that is a reasonable discussion to be having right now?
Well, I think it is reasonable to have the concern that Putin figured out a way to play Trump and play for time. But I also think that President Trump is frustrated enough now with Vladimir Putin, at least most days of the week, maybe not last Friday, but most of the time, that he won't allow Putin to just drag out talks indefinitely and escape any further economic pressure. So I'd like to see some discussion of that today as well, with the Western Europeans and Zelenskyy and Trump all agreeing that if there's no serious Russian engagement on negotiations in coming weeks, that sanctions should get tough early in the fall.
And you don't think sanctions getting tougher would preclude any type of peace? You think sanctions are kind of a likely scenario here?
Well, thank you for saying tougher. You're right. There are already plenty of tough sanctions, and we would be adding more. I think you have to put pressure on Putin. We've seen what happens when he feels like time is on his side militarily, economically, and politically. That's the way he felt all last year. And maybe he still feels that way. But with the Russian economy sort of stagnant at this point, I think we're going to have to increase the pressure. I mean, Russia's economy has sort of survived this war okay. And therefore, the pressure, I would conclude, has not been adequate.
If this works out in a broad sense, do you think that prevents Russia from getting even closer to a would-be BRICS alignment with Modi and Xi, or is that a near-term concern?
Well, it's a great question, because we in the United States have so gotten used to winning wars or having wars won in a sort of all-out, absolute way, whether it's World War II, the Cold War. We got to set the terms of the peace. In this case, that's not going to happen. And the question is, can we use the prospect of reintegrating Russia, even while Putin is still in power? Can we use that prospect as a positive incentive to try to induce a peace process? I think Trump, to be blunt, is cynical enough that he might, and I might have to agree with him, that even though it makes you hold your nose to want to think you could ever lift sanctions on a Putin-run Russia, there may not be any choice if you're really trying to get Russia to do a deal. Doesn't mean you lift all the sanctions. Doesn't mean any American company is going to be obliged to invest in Russia. I would think most of them will be wary for quite some time. But yeah, I think you probably have to offer the beginnings of a path towards partial rehabilitation, or Russia may never do a peace deal.
Right. Well, we remember when American corporates were withdrawing as the invasion began. It was a huge economic story for American business and multinationals. It would be an equally big story, investment story, if that were to reverse, right?
Absolutely. I remember fascinating conversations in New York put on by CNBC that I was part of in the spring of 2022, where American firms present were declaring that sanctions or no, they had pretty much lost their interest in doing business in Russia. So you're right, that's going to 3.5 years of war later. I'm not sure opinions would have changed that much. They probably would have only hardened. So that's why I could live with the idea of lifting some of the sanctions as part of a comprehensive peace deal, because it's not as if Russia is going to automatically be rewarded right away anyhow.
And what do you think a security guarantee would look like for Ukraine outside of some sort of NATO membership? Is that an option to have some sort of de facto U.S. support and protection of Ukraine in this kind of agreement? Or how do you see that shaping up?
Well, yeah, I love that we're having this conversation now because it's a big change from where we were. Georgetown professor Lise Howard and I have been writing the last few years about how you do these alternative security arrangements if you don't have NATO. And we think the most important thing, or at least a key element, is to have uniformed Western military personnel on the ground in Ukraine permanently, with the clear understanding that they would be backed up if Russia attacks rather than withdrawn, which is what happened in 2022. And if you do that, I think you have all sorts of options for what kind of chapeau you put over that in terms of legality or architecture. And you don't necessarily have to have a Senate-ratified treaty. I think the presence of ideally some American forces, at least in central and western Ukraine, as a potential rapid response force to go help others further east, that could be a nice arrangement. Whether Putin would ever consider that negotiable, I don't know. But I think it's worth teasing out those kinds of possibilities.
Right. Well, potentially historic meeting today. We'll definitely know a lot more by tonight. Let's hope. Michael O'Hanlon over at Brookings. Good to see you. Thanks, Michael.